Good afternoon and welcome to the CyberUK panel discussion on emerging cyber trends. I'm your chair for today. I am Eleanor Fairford. I'm Head of Incident Management in the NCSE, and I'll be steering our panel of experts through a discussion of the cyber events of the past year with some general reflections on the technological backdrop. And I will be challenging our panel to set out their insights into what the next year might hold. So with me today, we have 4 of the top experts in their fields from NCSE and beyond. And I'm hopeful that through bringing them together like this, we can have the opportunity to harness their insights and collectively articulate some of the big trends facing the sector today. So I'm going to start off by asking each of our panellists to introduce themselves, and then we can jump straight in. If we start please with you, Ian. Thank you.
Hi everyone, Ian Levy, Technical Director for the NCSC. I'm not sure who the experts that I'm supposed to be. You've got 3 experts and me.
Thanks, Ian. Christine.
Brilliant. So I'm Christine Maxwell and I'm the Director of Cyber Defence at the Ministry of Defence, and equally as intimidated by the expert's title.
Thanks, Christine. Graeme.
I'm Graeme Biggar from the National Crime Agency. I'm the Director General of the National Economic Crime Centre.
Brilliant. And on the screen we have Chich.
Hi, thanks, Eleanor. Hi, I'm Paul Chichester and I'm the Director of Operations at the NCSC.
Thanks very much to all of our panellists for joining us today. So we're going to structure our conversation around the buckets of the changing threat, the changing environment and technology. So for threats, I take that to mean the source of those who would seek to inflict harm on us, our adversaries in cyberspace. The environment is very much the surrounding context in which the actors may operate, be that commercial or social, the pandemic being a key one that we'll need to touch on, I think, today. As a crucial adjustment in much of our environment. And then also for technology, we're looking at the way and we've become more reliant than ever on technology over the past year and how this will doubtless shape our working environment going forward. So starting on threats, let's take a look at how it has evolved over the past year, be that the threat from states or from cybercrime. I'll turn to Chich for the NCSE perspective and then over to Christine for her perspective of how the threats have played out against the networks that she is responsible for as a large organisation, often at the sharp end of cyber activity. So to Chich first, looking back over the cyber landscape of the past year, we see the events of the past few months, particularly the SolarWinds cyber attack, where we saw software manipulated to open up backdoors available globally for Russian state actors. The scale, the profile of this incident, the political backlash, the public attribution, surely this matches up to those massive attacks that we saw in 2016 and 2017, like WannaCry, NotPetya. Do you think it was as bad this year as it was back then?
Thanks. And it is an interesting question because it's always hard to sort of measure or compare years. I think there's a danger in our industry that we always think the last year was the worst. But actually, when you do look back and you certainly say, 2015, 16, 17, there were some really high-profile attacks in those years and compromises. You had Tele Saint-Mon in 2015, you had NotPetya in 2017, WannaCry, which was a sort of defining moment in the NCSE sort of short history. So that there have definitely been large incidents that we've dealt with both nationally and internationally. And so was the last year any different, or was it the same? Was it worse? Certainly, at the scale end, NotPetya globally was a huge incident. SolarWinds again different, but certainly had a resonated globally, had a global impact. Perhaps things are slightly. The thing I would say is slightly different. Perhaps over the last year is the frequency of incidents we've been dealing with. You know yourself and Eleanor, sort of just how the numbers and that certainly, the collective impact, I think, is certainly going up. Ransomware this year, the Foreign Secretary today talked about, I think 80 incidents, ransomware incidents in the education sector. So I think, the total volume is certainly, I think, on an upward trend. And I think will always continue to be those sort of high-profile incidents that are dotted through the year. But overall, I think certainly it feels at a national level like the scale and the total volume of targeting we're seeing is definitely going up. And therefore, I would say that in the last 12 months, it certainly felt more. But obviously, also we're saying the impact of the pandemic on teams. I know, just on our teams and sort of the impact of dealing with that and the incidents. And I'm sure Christina will have a very sort of personal reflection on how it's felt within the Ministry of Defence.
Great, thank you, Chich. Yes, so absolutely, increasing numbers. Christine, how's it been from your perspective?
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, so the first thing I thought, well, it was been a busy year, would definitely be how that I would describe it. And I think we've seen the full range of the adversaries that we face, and them all being active in the year, and therefore keeping us busy, and seeing cyber in combination with other attack vectors as well as being direct on itself. So I think the adversary feels like they've upped their game, as we've all been putting more cyber defences in place, and we always say it's a race, isn't it? And it's felt like that this year, that there's been different attacks that we've seen, so we've had to be ready for those. And I think we've seen more in the supply chain as well, in terms of maybe we're just getting more reporting in that respect, but it feels like that is still a big area of focus, so that the threat is spread across us all, so we're all in it together. And the last thing I thought was, it's definitely been the year of making sure that you know what you've got and where it is, and it's came into really sharp focus in terms of that question. I don't know how often, I'm sure many watching it have been, asset visibility and knowing what that all is has been definitely a feature of the year.
Great, thank you, Christine. Ian, did you want to add in on this one at all?
Yeah, I will. Thanks, Eleanor. So I think kind of picking up from what Christine's just said, that sort of range of actors, we've got to be really careful we don't focus on the sexy stuff, right? How do we make sure we're not just concerned about the Russians and the Chinese and other nation states? A lot of the harm that we see, that threat, comes from cyber criminals, organised crime groups, and other things. And I think I'm starting to think we're kind of complicit in this. Do you know what I mean? So we have agency in this. The threat is interested in what we do because we allow them to do it easily, right? And whether that's cybercrime, whether it's nation states, we're not doing the basics to kind of to dissuade them from doing this to the UK. There's something for me about building better systems and building better technology that helps users be secure by default. And I think if we can demotivate the adversary somewhat, and we can do that through lots of different ways, right? We always talk about the really the cool stuff that we do, National Cyber Force, things like that. But just thinking through about, can we just make us harder than somewhere else? Can we make it so criminals go and make money in another country? Can we make it so nation states are not going to throw their best equity at us? They're not going to throw their best capability at us because it's going to get blown and it's not going to get them very much. That's what I think we need to do. It's changing that business model, changing the risk balance for them that I don't think we've done a good job of. And kind of the supply chain thing for me is case in point. So SolarWinds, it's big and it's nasty and it is what it is, right? But it's not the first supply chain attack we've seen. Chich mentioned NotPetya a couple of years ago. That was a supply chain attack done by the Russians again. But that's not the first one we saw. The first one I can remember is back in 2002, right? When SendMail, the open source, one of the biggest mail distribution programs on the planet, got popped through its distribution server. And we haven't really learned since then about how to defend it. So for me, the threat is changing. Again, like Chich, I'm not sure we can measure whether it's better or worse, but I know some of the ACD results, and I know Graeme will want to talk about fraud and cybercrime, but they've gone up a lot. And I think we need to be doing more about taking the technology to a place where it takes this out at source, rather than putting more and more burden on users and network defenders.
Very good, thank you. I've made a note then, none of this is new and we make it far too easy for them. Graeme, would you have anything to follow up on that at all?
Sure, well, I'll just take a step back from pure cybercrime for a second. So crime generally in this country has actually dropped over the last year through the pandemic. Fewer people outside, less opportunity for crime. Serious crime's actually gone up a little bit, and particularly online serious crime has gone up. So we have seen that absolutely in cybercrimes, as we've been talking about. We've seen it in the sexual abuse of children being watched online and encouraged online. And we've absolutely seen, as Ian has said, fraud being persecuted online in much greater extents than we have seen before. And some of that has been specifically related to the pandemic. So you've got specific COVID frauds that we have seen over the last year. Actually a relatively small number. At the peak it was about 2% of the frauds that were reported. Overall it's been less than 1%. But we've seen the extension of the trend we had before of a growth in fraud, and so we've been thinking about it in terms of fraud in a time of COVID. More people working at home, more people with money worries wanting to invest what they do have to get a better return, more people who are lonely looking for love online. Lots of things that have made fraud easier to do in the time of the pandemic. So that's gone up really quite a lot this year, and that's been a significant worry for us.
Thank you, that's fascinating, and I'm sure we'll return to that as we look at the environment and the pandemic in general. I did just want to pause briefly, Chich, on the SolarWinds attack from a more parochial perspective, which obviously was a very large deal for NCSE this year. Given that it was kind of an instance of like homegrown tools that then went on to have such widespread, massive effects that we sort of didn't anticipate. What does this tell us about the capabilities that sat behind those? Was this a cyber surprise that caught us unawares, or did we know that these capabilities were out there and this was just a sort of demonstration of stuff that we already knew?
Well, it's probably a bit of both. I mean, I think if you look at actually the techniques that were being used, and we've talked about supply chain not being necessarily a new vector, some of the capabilities that were being put down were not particularly new. I mean, actually sort of increasingly sort of using capabilities that are living off the land, as we call it, but using techniques that are more available. So, actually when you look at the individual elements of that, and I think many other attacks and other compromises and other threats that we've seen this year, there's nothing uniquely different or unusual about them. I think perhaps what is different about the SolarWinds attack is just how some of those capabilities have been put together, the way that has been done in a very sort of careful, considered way by the adversary. We've touched on before, the operational security that was employed, making it really hard for defenders. Broaden out. I mean, very much, as defenders of networks, we're always looking for that seed of information that we can then pivot from and build out. Adversaries, including the SolarWinds case, are obviously, understand that. And so I think, perhaps what was slightly, different was that. But it again, was it a surprise? Well, I think, I sort of look at two pieces of sort of data, I suppose, in that answering that question. The first is actually, did our guidance I get it wrong, and I don't think it did. I think if I'm not saying that following the guidance to the letter of the law is easy, but actually a lot of the work that we've done in the past about building architectures, defence in depth, all of those things actually kicked in, and actually when you look at the other part of that sort of equation, when you look at organisations who did follow it, we did a lot of work in the UK working with organisations who obviously did use SolarWinds, and actually it was quite heartening how many had followed that guidance and the principles that we've talked about in the past enough that they did actually have a good defence against it. So, I don't think it was a particular surprise. I think actually we always talk about the organisations that weren't defended, but I think actually increasingly the trend is that for incidents like this, there are more and more organisations that are defended, and perhaps that's a story we probably want to talk about a bit more as well.
Brilliant, thank you, Titch. So I think we'll move on from the threat landscape more towards now the environment. So the environment that we've all been working in over the past year, obviously, we can't look back over the recent trends without mentioning the pandemic and how much things changed in that context, including obviously everyone working from home, remote working, the massively increased threat surface that we all experienced. So I thought if I'd just turn to Graeme for his insights into how the fraudsters really proliferated during this period. You've mentioned already, fraud in a time of COVID. That seems it seems a very obvious place to pause. Clearly, COVID provided a fertile ground for all sorts of COVID-related fraud and other scams, exploiting people at their most vulnerable, and you've touched on romance fraud as well as another example. I think really the question I was wondering is that in some respects, people are now more used to it. Are people perhaps wising up, and becoming more familiar with these kinds of frauds? Or are you seeing just as much success as the numbers go up as you have described?
Well, the numbers are still going up, sadly. So I think people are wising up, but the volumes are increasing of the things that are coming in, and they're coming in on loads of different dimensions. You're getting the emails, as we've had for ages, and we've now got good systems in place to try and deal with that, but lots still gets through. We've got phone calls coming in, we've got texts coming in, and it's just coming in at such volume. So very few of them are successful in resulting in getting people defrauded, but they come in at such volume that doesn't matter to the fraudsters, because they still manage to catch enough people. But it's not just the volume, it's the sophistication of the way that they do it. They are basing it. It links back to cyber and hacking attacks. The data is exfiltrated from major companies, and it is then recycled through the dark web, picked up by organised criminals who do fraud, and it means that their attacks can be really quite targeted and use information which convinces people that it really is the person they think that is communicating with them, that it's someone that knows something about them, and they should pass over information, their personal data, their bank details. So it's partly more sophisticated in the data that's using. It's also quite sophisticated in the kind of psychological profiling they use. And I've listened to many of these calls now, and they try and instill a sense of fear and urgency in people, a sense of authority behind the call, and panic people into making rush decisions. And decisions that, when you're sitting back and listening to it slightly loftily, you'd think, well, I wouldn't do that. But actually, everyone is vulnerable to being put in that position with that kind of call just being caught off guard. And so we're absolutely seeing that happen. And so although people are wising up to it, with the volume and the sophistication, enough of it is still getting through to be a real problem.
Thank you, and that does make sense. I wonder if I can turn to Ian and perhaps also to Chich. I know, Ian, obviously there's been a lot of activity in your area to work on this problem. What's your perspective on how this is working?
So I probably shouldn't say this on a live thing, right? But let's be honest, the people that are purporting some of these frauds and scams are basically scum, right? They are using the people's absolute vulnerability. They are using, as Graeme says, they're putting fear into people when they're at their most vulnerable to get them to do something. And the ACD report that we put out last week shows the scale that we can see. Now, I know for a fact we're not seeing everything. I know for a fact that the takedowns that we're doing are not quick enough to fix the whole problem. They're not scaled enough. We're not going to do it by playing whack-a-mole like this. So I think we've got to step back and work out how we change the business model for some of this stuff. So how do we make it so that attacking UK citizens in this way doesn't necessarily help them? And that, for me, is the thing. How do you stop the buggers making money? Because that's what they're after in this case. And I think there's a whole set of things we could think about how we build an ecosystem around this, to make sure that we don't end up with the UK being an easy target. And I think this isn't just about cyber stuff, right? This is about how the finance system works. It's how the phone system works. It's how policing works with the communities to help them understand more. I think there's lots more we can do across government and across the community to help people. The other thing I'd say about environment, about how technology is evolving, is our dependence is really changing. So if you think about this, right? If the UK phone network went down, if the UK ISP network went down, we'd kind of not be able to do this. The fact that we can do this is incredibly cool. I mean, it's seamless, but it is absolutely amazing. All the different standards, all the different protocols that are making this happen. How do we make sure that reliance is in the right place? And so I've been thinking about how we change marketplaces, how we change incentives. And if you look at the telecom security bill that came into that's in Parliament now, one of the intentions for that is to try and make the UK telecoms networks, which we are all relying on much more resilient and much more secure, because there's really no incentive to do it really well at the moment. Nobody, this is a cyber conference, right? Nobody on this conference buys their broadband based on how secure the PE nodes in the MPLS network are. Nobody, not even me, right? You buy it on whether you get free Netflix. And so there's absolutely no incentive, no reason for telcos, for example, to put more effort than is necessary to meet their regulatory requirements into fixing their network. How do we change that? And how do we start to build a market around security being a differentiator rather than a pain in the bum? And I think that for me is, if we can work to try and understand how these business models work, even intelligence agencies have business models, right? I mean, Chich alluded to how much effort the SVR put into the SolarWinds attack. That was a step up, right? And again, probably shouldn't say this, but there's professional respect there, right? They were technically very good. Was it worth it to them to put that amount of effort in? I guess we'll never know, but it's an interesting data point about what's going on in our adversaries that should be driving what we do in terms of defences. How do we fix the dumb stuff quickly and make their jobs harder? And then how do we defend against the much, much more sophisticated stuff in a way that's sustainable? So that was really rambly, I'm sorry.
Thank you, no, that's great, thank you. I was going to try and reflect the same question back to you, Chich, regarding the increased cyber threat during the recent, during lockdown, remote working, the increased attack surface. How have you seen the changes during that change in environment?
So I think this, again, sort of looking, environment in a couple of ways. I think one, building on what Ian said about, how we are more reliant on technology. And a lot of what we're talking about today is actually about risk in organizations and how that risk is changing over time. And, how we use technology, how we're reliant on technology now and infrastructure as organizations in a way we were never before, fundamentally changes our environment, I think, as nations and as organizations. So I think that's definitely sort of, one area that's changed. I think also something that, I've talked to people about in the past is we all made risk decisions, we all made choices about how we did things and how we went online and how we became, much more digitally enabled. But we probably cut a few corners. And so there are organizations now that perhaps do need to go back and reflect on the environment they created and say, well, actually, now, where I find myself, is now a good time to go back and maybe look at those legacy, or what will become legacy risks in the future if I don't go back. And so there's a sort of, I think sometimes we create an environment for ourselves unconsciously. We don't think about the environment we're creating. And I suppose my final sort of thought on that and sort of building on that is we create ourselves an incredibly complex environment. If you think about, any of the organizations we are now, generally life, the world, how we use technology is becoming more complex. Enterprises are adding complexity to their businesses, very often without knowing it through atomic decision making. But actually, all of that complexity increases risk potentially if you do it in an unconstrained way. And so I think there's something about, in the environment we live, given that the world and the environment is by its nature becoming more complex, how do we consciously drive some of that complexity down? And how can we reduce some of that complexity in the decision making that we have, again, nationally and as enterprises?
Brilliant, thank you, Chich. And I'm conscious also that this change in environment, you will have witnessed this, Christine, defending the networks that you're responsible for.
Yeah.
How would you characterise what you've seen?
I couldn't help but smile as Chich was saying that, in terms of, I was saying to Ian, I was just pointing at myself in terms of a kind of complex environment that we are at the MOD. And so even personally, the amount of phishing emails and text messages that I get personally has definitely felt like it's really ratcheted up over the year. But in terms of environment, the thing I kind of wanted to pick up on, certainly from our perspective, is COVID's accelerated digital and working from home and new ways of working than we've ever had before. And we don't want to change that. We want that to continue. And so we were already talking about digital transformation, but I think the environment that we're in now is much more focused on that and what can we really take advantage of. The Defence Command Plan was full of conversations about digital UK, Britain's position in the world, how we are going to build a digital backbone. And so huge change in focus in terms of that kind of broader environment that we do now work in. And so we've got to be ready for that future. And, I'm sure we'll come on to it when we talk technology in a minute, but I think that's critical. I think the environment has changed around us, and as cyber defenders, we need to be in it. And it's been interesting watching the news just the last couple of days, even with the event in the US, and just listening how journalists talk about cyber. And I was watching the news last night, and it was it was it felt like it was coming up the agenda, the business agenda, because it was like, this was just something that happens in the background, isn't it? And oh, actually, but it's causing a huge impact to the US economy and the US citizens, and just it just felt like we were maybe on the move in the environment in that respect. I thought it's an interesting time.
Definitely, that's a really fascinating insight. Thank you. Yeah, I think you're right. Graeme, do you have any reflections on the environment?
So just picking up on what Chich was saying earlier on about we have designed complexity into the system, I think two other things that are true at the moment is we as a society have a massive expectation for convenience and speed. In everything we do now, definitely in the IT we work with, but everything we do online. And then we also have changed what we trust as well online, and there is now a much greater reliance on trust of user-generated content, be it TripAdvisor or just what you were seeing from friends. And that provides a real opportunity for fraudsters and criminals, because the speed makes it harder for friction to be put into the system that would stop crime. It makes it harder for people to put systems in place that just help people pause, and it enables the criminal to push you along into making decisions quickly. So it's going back to Ian's point earlier on about we need a whole system piece of thinking about what kind of online world and digital world we want to have. And we need to have some trade-offs in there, which one will be about speed versus friction and safety. And we want to find a way, obviously, of designing it so that you don't sacrifice too much of the speed. But we might have to. We certainly have to accept that it's part of the expectation that we have all collectively as society created, which has caused part of the problem.
That's fascinating, absolutely.
Eleanor, can I jump in again? So just listening to that conversation's got me thinking about some other stuff. So we keep talking about this complexity and reliance on technology and how we don't really think through about how people are going to use these things, how these things are going to affect people. We concentrate way too much on the technology and the bits and the bytes rather than the bag of water that's sat in front of it often. There's a thing for me about doing the simple stuff at scale in a way that just takes that friction away from the defenders. So instead of taking the friction away from the attackers, how do we take the friction away from the defenders? That could be a citizen, or it could be an enterprise, right? I've just been thinking, so Christine mentioned Digital UK. So if we're going to become a Digital UK, that kind of underpinning plumbing has to be much more resilient and secure than it is today. And if I just look at what's happened over the last few months in terms of public descriptions of vulnerabilities and how they've been played with, three kind of jump out to me. So the Microsoft Exchange thing that happened a couple of months ago, where there was a bug in Microsoft Exchange, it was being actively exploited apparently by China, and then as soon as the patch came out, it started being weaponized by criminals and others for other ends. We happened to be able to kind of watch how that played out across the UK. It was just a feature of the particular vulnerability and the particular product it was in allowed us to use the ACD platform to understand what the UK looked like in terms of risk. Watching people not patch was very, very interesting. Right, so you've got a huge amount of noise about this thing in the press, and we ended up sending mails to people in an automated system going, hey, you appear to be running Exchange, you appear to be running an out-of-date version, could you please apply this patch? Here's a link to the Microsoft website, or here's, go find it on the Microsoft website. And after about a week, that changed to, hey, you appear to be running an out-of-date version of Exchange, could you please apply the patch? And you've now got 70 different web shells down on your Exchange server, please, here's how to go and remove them. We saw a peak of removals quite early, but then the tail is massive. And I just wonder if people don't actually know they've got these damn things. They don't equate my email with the Microsoft Exchange server. And so again, there's a different way of talking about this stuff that I think we have to get on top of to help people demystify it. The second set of things was around VPNs. So, the ops team put out another alert last week before, can't remember, Chich, about Pulse Secure VPN, where we've got actors who are exploiting vulnerabilities that are 18 months old, something like that. And as people have moved online for work, they've started using VPNs more. And so people should be more aware that they have a VPN. And so they should be more aware they've got a VPN and go, oh, maybe it's this one, I should go patch it. So again, there's something for me about how we help people tie these real-world journalistic stories, like you were talking about, Christine, onto their own context. And then there's, again, taking the pain away at scale, the consumer IoT legislation that's going through at the moment. So this is about how do you make sure that when I buy something in the UK, you know, my next internet-connected toaster, how do I make sure that it's secure? How do I make sure it's secure enough? And the thing around this is about how do you give people high-quality information? And we did a whole bunch of research about, you know, could you build a food label type thing where you got reds and greens, you know, this product does this and doesn't do that, and you buy something with more greens. Turned out it was too difficult. And so what the legislation does is it makes it very difficult and expensive in terms of fines for somebody to sell a product in the UK that's crap from a security point of view. If you can't tell me it hasn't got any default passwords, if you can't tell me you're going to keep it up to date for a decent amount of time, and you can't tell me that you've got a way of reporting vulnerabilities in the product that you're going to fix, don't sell it in the UK. It's kind of the not on my doorstep. And I think this is going to help across the piece, right? It's going to help us with nation states. I think it's going to help us with cybercrime. It's going to help us just raise the cyber hygiene of the UK. That's the start, and you start to raise it more and more and more over the next few years as manufacturers and retailers start to take this stuff on. That's, you know, government isn't good for much stuff, but I think it is good for trying to build incentives where they don't otherwise exist. Again, sorry, rant. Sorry.
That's really helpful. Thank you. So I thought I'd just pause at this point on the kind of, you mentioned VPNs there, for instance, and some of the things we became increasingly reliant upon in the context of the pandemic and the known issues that we had that then became amplified due to the changes in ways of working. And was it not, in some respects, it was entirely predictable that some of these things would then go on to be exploited? So, I mean, I'll leave that thought out there and see if anyone's got any comments, but certainly on your side, Graeme, when it came to the financial support schemes that we saw launched in the context of COVID, was it not entirely predictable that those would be targeted by fraudsters, and this would be a sort of a honeypot that would attract criminal and cyber criminal activity? Do you think we anticipated that sufficiently at that stage, and could more have been done by way of protective measures at that point?
Yes, thank you for that question.
Sorry.
I always like having to answer this question and then speak to ministers afterwards. Should it have been predicted? Yes. Was it predicted? Yes. Could we have done more to have stopped it? Well, yes, but there was a political choice there that was quite challenging. The Cabinet Office have overall responsibility for this, completely by coincidence, brilliant timing. They produced a paper back in January or February on fraud risks in times of major crisis. And that was built on the experience the Australians had in their bushfires the previous year and all the schemes that they had put in place to compensate Australian citizens after that. So there was a bunch of learning, and there were active conversations in government before the pandemic hit. And then there were a series of active conversations around each of the schemes as they were being set up about the fraud risk and how to protect against it. So there were conscious and active decisions, which is exactly what you want. And then you've got a political choice about how much you try and reduce the fraud risk versus how much you enable the money to get out the door quickly. And when you think back to what the world was like in March, April last year, there was a really clear imperative that, frankly, everyone felt to get the money out of the door quickly. In fact, one of the schemes was set up because the first scheme that was set up wasn't getting the money out the door quickly enough. So some checks were put in place, more could have been. We then went back, and there were lots of discussions between us and all the agencies involved about extra checks that could be put in place, what we were seeing happening, how we could stop more fraud happening. And various extra checks were put in place over the course of the year to try and make fraud harder to perpetrate. Of course, I mean, it happened pre-COVID, government schemes of any sort, government tax, government benefits. That fraud goes on into that all the time. It is an occupational hazard. It's about your level of risk and the amount of resources you're prepared to put in to clamp down on it. There will have been quite a lot, and I mean, the NAO have said this, the various different departments who are responsible for the schemes have published their assessments of how much fraud or loss, because there might be credit loss as well, people not able to pay back entirely legitimately money that they borrowed. And they're quite big figures. Getting into exactly how much criminality there is behind it is not simple. We have certainly investigated quite a few ourselves. We've made 13 arrests from the NCA into frauds against the bounce back loan scheme. HMRC are doing an awful lot against their schemes. NATIS, investigative force, BASAR, are supporting with local authorities, are doing a lot. So there are arrests. It will take some time to see quite how much has been stolen.
Thank you, Graeme. Can I use the same question for you, Chich, and then maybe Ian? How would you judge how well the NCSC did, or how well we did, in predicting the sorts of threats that would come up as a result of work, the increased work from home, increased threat to surface that was presented in lockdown? And how would you judge our performance in kind of preparing people and ensuring that that was made safe during this period?
So I think, again, obviously the national response to the pandemic was at the centre of NCSC's work for a long period of time, immediately from, really when the nation started to respond. And I think we've talked a little bit about it before, in our sort of annual report. I think we stepped up and we did a huge amount of really positive work across the UK, across economy, across the public and private sector. We certainly, and Ian's team put a lot of work into developing guidance that we put online very quickly for organisations to help themselves defend against that. We brought online the suspicious email reporting service, and again, that sort of was a capability. I think just sort of but building on something that Graeme was talking about there. There's always, you do what you can in the moment. There's always a cost of not doing something. And so you always have that trade-off between how much can I predict that will happen, how much threat can I predict, and how much can I learn about the threat by doing things. And I think, that's always a balance for any person or any organisation setting up a platform or a system. And I think we learn rapidly. And I think one of the things that perhaps we did effectively and, actually was not getting everything right on day one, but absolutely learning rapidly and that feedback loop into changing how we did things, adapting how we did things, and that the speed of the feedback loop, I think, on how we were operating over the last 12 months is perhaps one of the positive legacies of the pandemic, is just that willingness, that recognition that the cost of not doing something can sometimes be greater than the cost of doing something, and so therefore actually getting out there, actually doing services, making them as good as you can, but then learning as quickly as you can as they develop is probably one of the takeaways I'll certainly take.
Thank you, Chich. Ian, do you have any reflections?
So as you probably know, I'm a data geek. I think, so Chich has said a bunch of stuff about what we did, right? We pivoted to help protect the health sector and the vaccine supply chain, pivoting, the ops teams to make sure those organisations were better informed and better protected, pivoting some of the ACD services to protect the NHS. You can read about some of that in the annual report and the ACD report. As Chich said, we put a load of guidance out, everything from new guidance for architectures through to exercise in a box modifications, you name it, we've got guidance on it. They're all input metrics. And the thing I don't understand how we're going to measure yet is the output metrics. So actually, here we go. Let's use the YouTube chat channel. So we've never done this before, right? This might work, it might fall on its backside. If you are watching, I hope some of you are, and this isn't just a waste of electrons, use the chat channel. Tell us, if you were aware of the guidance we were putting out, was it relevant to you and was it helpful, right? If the answer to those things are no, then we'll know what to do differently next time, right? But seriously, the only way we're going to get better is by getting honest feedback. So give us feedback, use the chat channel, come onto the inquiries page on the NCSC website if you want to do it that way, but do tell us whether what we did over the last year was useful. We've put a load of data out, as much as we actually can, around the threat to the UK, the threat to the health sector, the threat to the vaccine supply. As Graeme's been talking about, some of the massive increase in cyber-enabled and cyber crime. We've put out data, we've put out guidance. Is it good enough? Tell us, right? And I'm deadly serious, right? Because if it's not good enough, we're not doing our jobs properly. So let us know. The other thing I'd say quickly is the IR, so the integrated review, talked about the UK becoming a science and technology power, which sounds awesome, right? It sounds absolutely awesome. if we're going to do that, we've got some fantastic researchers, some fantastic SMEs, but at the moment, we don't really help them protect themselves. You know, certain nation states like nicking intellectual property through cyber means. We've got to make that harder if we're going to become this S&T powerhouse. We've got a problem around people buying our innovative startups and using them for their own use. We've published some stuff around guidance for SMEs about how to protect themselves better, guidance for investors to again try and build that incentive model for investors to demand better security in SMEs. We've got the the National Security Investments Bill, which is all about foreign direct investment into these sectors. So I think we can start to build better stuff and build a better environment for this. But like I say, input metrics are easy. Help me build output metrics. Tell us what we're doing well and what we're not doing well.
Brilliant, thanks Ian. I love the idea of using the interactive comments and chat to seek feedback, so please do take up Ian's suggestion. Graeme, did you want to come in as well?
So 2 other things I would mention that we did collectively in the pandemic to try and reduce COVID fraud risks, which are kind of tangentially related to this, this event. So one, and it's using data, which is I'm clutching at straws here slightly, but obviously the government had to buy an awful lot of PPE, an awful lot of medical equipment, or the NHS did, and the government. And one thing we did in that was, with the NHS, get the data on the people who were bidding for contracts and run them through our systems and the police systems to see whether the individuals or the companies involved kind of hit on our systems, and that would be a trigger not to not give the contract, you might be absolutely fine, but at least to pause and do a bit more due diligence. So we could use the bulk data that we're beginning to gather properly with the right kind of checks and balances and compliance around it to make for better decisions. So that was one thing we'd done that we'd not really done before during COVID. The second, which is a bit more integral to NCSC, was debates, and NCSC led more of this than we did, but we were involved too, with the government and about how best to communicate to the public. Now that's easy when you're just doing it from a press conference, but when you're going to go out to individuals, be it on test and trace or then on the vaccine to try and encourage people to come forward for specific appointments and book in, how do you do that? You can do that in a safe way, but how can you do it in a way that can't be mimicked by fraudsters who will then contact you in parallel and you go through their systems and end up passing over your personal details or bank details? And that's quite hard. On vaccines, we've actually been quite successful, and that's not really, I think, down to us being brilliant in it. It's because the public know that they're not going to be asked to pay for a vaccine. NHS, free at the point of delivery, very clear to the British public. And so as soon as they go down a link and they're asked to put in bank details, a warning bell rings and they stop. And so the amount of that kind of fraud that's happened is really low. People may have passed over their personal data before they got to that point, which would obviously be still really problematic, but we haven't seen very much of it. What we've struggled with, and I remember a question coming in from a government minister when we said, please don't send out bulk text to everyone with a link in it, asking them to click on the link, because that's against all our guidance. That's not what we want to happen. And the question back, which we need to have a better answer to, is, well, what's your alternative then? How do we find a way of communicating in bulk in a way that's going to be easy for people to access, and we're not going to get a massive drop-off? Because if we just tell them to go onto the gov.uk website, most of them won't. We need to provide a link. Find a way of making it easy. And there is a challenge I think we still need to rise to.
Brilliant, thank you. That was really fascinating to hear. Can we move on to you, Christine?
And the only thing I wanted to almost answer Ian's question in terms of did we find it useful and did we use it? Absolutely, and I'm sure I speak for many people watching, because in those early days of the pandemic, and you know, we were an organisation that broadly worked 5 days a week in the office all the time, and it was a huge change for us. And the security team sitting going, right, we've got to get guidance and awareness, and what are we going to do? And you're sitting designing that, and it's just always nice to go and check what the NCSC have said on this, and just get somebody else's perspective into it. So, you know, I don't know what's in the Twitter feed, but we did certainly look at it. If I'm any representation of the wider, you know, group of organisations that are out there, it is valuable.
And can I just jump in straight on that? Just to wholeheartedly endorse it. I think the NCSC has played a blinder through, I mean, it's a good organisation anyway, but I think it's played a blinder through COVID. And, you know, slightly irritatingly from my point of view, every time I thought, oh, there's a potential risk here, I hope we're doing something about it, and called up the NCSC, they're like, yeah, Graeme, we're on that. So it's been really impressive.
Well, that's fantastic. Some real-time feedback. We appreciate it. Thank you. I think on that note, I'll just move us on to the next section where we want to talk about technology, obviously a key theme at the moment. And Jeremy Fleming, the director of GCHQ, mentioned in his speech yesterday that obviously the pandemic's driven us apart, but it's technology that has played a really important role in bringing us together. It's even more central to society now, and data is the crown jewels that we should protect. So I thought that was very relevant for today. Ian, we've discussed this. It strikes me that as we become more and more dependent on technology to enforce aspects of controls within society that are more acceptable in the context of the pandemic, so we become more and more dependent on these things running our day-to-day lives, do we risk becoming over-dependent and potentially sleepwalking into some sort of technological authoritarian dystopia where technology is everywhere?
Yeah, sure. Let's do that, yeah. So I think if we're not careful, you might, but I think there's enough safeguards and checks and balances in the UK that we're not going to do that. I think our job is to make sure that we give people the right information so they can make sensible choices, and whether that's ministers or your average person on the street, it doesn't really matter. For me, I think there's a thing about what we've done during the pandemic, and would you want to keep doing that in the future? So the things that we've done in the pandemic were absolutely necessary during the pandemic. It's a conscious decision, I think, by society and ministers about what we do for those things in the future. There's a question for me about, do people really understand the impact that the internet economy has on their real lives? So yeah, you use these services, they're free at the point of use. Everybody knows they're not free. You're the product, it's the advertising revenue. How does that data actually affect you more and more? I've got this horrible thought that one day somebody's going to take, I've got a Fitbit on because I'm supposed to be losing weight, failing, obviously. Somebody takes my Fitbit data, the location-based services advertising data that I get on my mobile phone, and works out that every time I get an advert for wheatgrass, 10% off wheatgrass drinks, I don't click. And every time I get 10% off a burger joint, I do click. That I've just been for a short walk and my heart rate is elevated and it's taking a long time to go down. I sell that to an insurer. That's really intrusive on me, because they know that I'm a fat, unfit sod. I mean, you can tell, but they know now. So there's a question about the data and how we protect it. I think what Jeremy was talking about isn't just how we stop people accessing, but how you stop kind of unnatural and unnecessary discovery using that data. There's also something about whose technology you're using. So software and technology generally now, I think, encodes values. And when you buy a piece of software, you're kind of implicitly accepting the values of the developer or the country it came from. And we've got to be more honest about that. There's got to be a way of having that conversation in a way that most people can consume. That's going to be really hard, but I think it's absolutely necessary. I think if we are to build these systems in a way that is okay for people to trust them, we've got to get in front of it now. So we've put the Smart Cities guidance out last week, all about how we help local authorities build better places for citizens, but doing it in a safe and reliable and resilient way. That's going to take a while for us to really understand what the different moving parts are, but now is the time to do it. And so I think if we're careful and we're considered and we're honest, and we talk about details, not hyperbole, I think we can absolutely avoid that. And I think we must do that, by the way.
Brilliant, thank you. That's really helpful. So we've got how technology itself can be used and potentially subverted. There's something about how individuals make use of online platforms, etc. And I understand, Graeme, that you talked about the bill that's now been announced. Can you talk us through how that's going to protect individuals?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, and it bridges from what Ian was saying earlier about the role of government in ensuring the right incentives are in place. And that can be, if you lose data, people's data as a company, that doesn't actually hurt you much. And are people not going to use your company anymore? They might, but probably not. there isn't enough incentive on companies not to lose data, so you've got to make sure you're refining them enough to put the right incentives in place. You've got to make sure that the regulations around toasters are sufficient so that Ian's wired toaster is not spying on him and reporting to his insurance company. But the thing that's happened just today is the government coming out and saying for the first time that in the online safety bill that they announced in the Queen's speech and announced more detail on today, that they're going to include fraud within that bill, which wasn't the case the day before yesterday. It wasn't in the original draft of the bill and the consultation. And we in the National Economic Crime Centre and the NCA and a whole host of people have been arguing for some time that it needs to be included, and that there is a really significant online harm being created by the tech sector and through the tech sector that needs to be addressed through a form of regulation. And the government's announced today that it agrees and it's going to be included. But specifically to your point, Eleanor, it is only about user-generated content. And that's still really important, and it goes back to the point I made earlier on about trust, and people really trust user-generated content, so it can be a really important vector for fraudsters to use. It's really relevant to a series of crimes, be it online shopping or romance fraud, but it's not the totality of what needs to be addressed online. So investment fraud, which a huge amount of money, life-changing amounts of money for people are lost through. The problem there is not so much user-generated content, it's paid for advertising and websites that, between Ian and us, we are trying to take down now through the active fraud defence work. That is up there, and it's on Google, you can search it through Google, and it needs to be taken down quicker. So the online safety bill won't address that, and we need to come to that, and there is work in hand to do it. But it is really positive that fraud and user-generated content for fraud is going to be included in the bill.
Great, thank you. So user-generated material, but technology in general and the way that it's built. I'm conscious that as we're increasingly more and more reliant, it's the building itself. It needs to be done in a way that makes it safe for the individual to be able to use. So perhaps I could start with you, Chich, and then back to Ian and others after that. So Chich, your views please on that.
Yeah, well, I think, we just on the sort of technology point, we've talked a little bit about some of the risks and how we're sort of managing those. I think for me, I'd sort of just touch on the benefit that technology has brought us around sort of certainly the last 18 months, but beyond. We've talked, I think Graeme talked earlier about the scale of the threat. Well, sometimes scale can play to your advantage if you're trying to combat that and actually using technology in a way that automatically sort of counters some of that stuff. We've talked about that. But as network defenders and as part of the organisation that's trying to ultimately understand the threat and respond to it and counter it, technology is a huge enabler in allowing us to do that at scale, allowing us to do it in a more automated way, and actually understand the threat in a way that we couldn't perhaps have done before. So I think there are huge benefits of that technology from helping us defend the UK and helping us to respond. And so, from our point of view, that's a positive. I think the one thing I would sort of add to that, though, perhaps as a caveat, is we talk about the technology a lot. I think what we don't talk about enough is perhaps the very boring subject, but the business change around making the most of it and getting the most out of it. And I think that's something that, again, we all need to keep doing. I mean, Ian's talked about the consequences of technology if we get that wrong. I think there's also, as an organisation, getting the most out of technology. And actually understanding it more. And I think that's a real challenge for society, and that's a challenge for enterprises, but really getting under the skin of not what the technology is, but how it can be used and how it can be used appropriately, how it can be used less so. And that level of expertise within organisations, I think, is really important to keep fostering and make it a real organisational conversation, not just an IT department conversation, but how are we going to use technology as an enterprise in its widest sense.
Thank you, Chich. Christine, for your thoughts, please.
Yeah, so picking up more of the organisation side of it, I look at the whole technology thing, and you've got it in kind of groups. It's the technology that we've already got today and we maybe aren't even exploiting well enough, and therefore do we really know how to defend it and how much our adversary already knows about that technology, plus the near technology that's coming down the line, and then the stuff that's a bit more out there in terms of the future. So I think we've got to look at that, and I just think, secure by design is one of my mantras in terms of we've just got to get it as early as we can and stop thinking that we can protect it right at the end of a development life cycle or the likes in terms of that. But some of that technology we've got now today is already super complex. I've essentially got aircraft that are flying computers and all sorts of new tech out there, and secure by design's just got to be, all of our sort of number one thing, I think.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, secure by design is absolutely my mantra as well. I think you can do it at an enterprise level like Christine's doing. I think we need to do it at a global technology level as well. So we've got this thing called the Digital Secure by Design program, which DCMS run, that we help with. And under the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, we've been funding the development of a memory-safe microprocessor. So remember, things like buffer overflows, memory safety flaws, have been around since 1972. And as a community, we've done bugger all about fixing them. We're actually doing something now. So ARM are about to tape out, or have just taped out, a memory-safe version of the ARM processor. Right? So you cannot buy hardware do buffer overflows and other memory safety errors on it. So you take a whole class of vulnerability out. You can't stop people writing crappy code, but you can mitigate the impact of it by changing the underlying hardware. I think if we can do that, if we can start to build a market then that prefers those things, and we can start off with simple stuff, right? So yes, you could say you can only buy something that's got this new microprocessor type in it, or you could say, we're government, right? We buy a load of stuff. We're going to prefer software that's compiled with DEP and ASLR. We're going to prefer web services that publicly say they conform to the OWASP Top 20. There's a whole bunch of stuff we could do to try and, again, shift that dial, shift that incentive model to do the right thing. I think we've got to start building systems that are tolerant to exploitation. I mean, Chich mentioned this right at the start. Not everybody who had SolarWinds Orion was compromised, even when they updated, because they'd architected their systems properly. I think we've got to do much more of that, about that defense in depth, tolerant to exploitation, and again, really get to vulnerability management. So how do we make it trivial for people to patch? How do we make it trivial for them always to be up to date? And then, as Graeme's kind of alluded to a few times, there's this systemic approach where we don't just do the tech. Yeah, Chich just said we need to make the best of what we've got. Graeme said we need to do it across lots of different entities. There's a thing for me about how we do a systemic approach to this so that we are not just building tech for the sake of building tech, but it's part of a bigger set of stuff that's actually going to have an effect.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That's fantastic. I'm conscious now we're into our last few minutes, so I'm really keen to make sure that we capture your insights regarding what you think is coming over the horizon. I want you to imagine we're back together on this panel, regrouping in Newport, in Wales, this time next year. When you do that look back, what is it that you're going to pull out as the key trends of what is now the year to come? What are the things that we're going to be discussing? And I will take a note so that I can hold you to it in a year's time. So I thought if we can run through, perhaps starting with Chich.
Thanks, Alan, and no pressure then. And this will be recorded for posterity, won't it? So we can even play it back. So I used a sort of a triple of ideas yesterday, and I'll sort of reflect back on that. So what do I believe we'll be saying in a year's time? I think we'll be saying that we prevented more harm than we have this year, through all the ideas that we've talked about, through all the sort of learning that we're doing, through all the ideas that we're trying to work from, the sort of strategic, secure by design, through to the more operational and tactical ideas. But prevention is better than cure, and we will have prevented more. I think there's something about, we will have found more organisations are prepared when they are compromised. And through that preparation, they will have reduced the harm, and they will have made it harder for the adversary. Ian touched on some of those concepts earlier. And so I think we will be in a happy place of seeing that people are far more prepared than they used to be to respond. And I think the third one is partnerships, and that we will be talking about an ever-growing trend of this being a team sport, of partnerships across the public-private sector with international partners, and we will really be living that mantra of that team sport concept. So those are the sort of my predictions for a year's time.
Lovely, thank you very much. Can I turn please to Christine for your predictions?
Are we allowed to have some of the same? We might have that. So So I think I'd like to see cyber as more of a sort of business enterprise challenge, even more than it is today, and really up the agenda. I do think there'll be another set of complex attacks that will, sort of impact us all globally. I guess I do suspect that. But and then the third one, I would say, I do think the whole, as Chich said about that we are more joined up. I said we're a more joined up UK. Ian laughed at me when I said that earlier. So, but I think, that whole even, NCSC, MOD, government, industry, working much more closely together in actually the defence. And I want to see the recover word much more in terms of actually that we're not just about protection and detection, that actually we're able to recover. And I think that's a bit of a forgotten that, it'd be good to have a story on that.
Lovely, thank you. That's really good. I'm conscious we're down to our final minutes. Graeme, if I could ask you for your predictions.
I agree with Chich. And I think in addition to that, I mean, more prevention and more partnerships would have been absolutely fundamental to what I said. I think the other bit I'd add in then is being even clearer with the public and having them being more aware about what they can do and can't do or should be really careful about. I think NCSC have done a really good job on that, but we need to be kind of equally good on broader fraud risks.
Lovely, thank you. And final word to you, please, Ian. Thanks.
Thanks. So I'm hoping we'll be able to say we've made a decent dent in the harm that ransomware can cause in the UK. I hope we're at the point where we can start to objectively measure the vulnerability of the UK and start to understand what that means and what interventions are necessary to be able to reduce that vulnerability. Foreign Secretary this morning said we're going to extend the ACD services. I don't know if this is what he meant, but I'd like to see ACD-like services, maybe not run by us, maybe run by others, that better protect the public, SMEs, charities, those sorts of things, in a way that we can't scale to do. And then, because it's the second day of Cyber UK and it's the end of the day, I'm also predicting I will also have a hangover.
Lovely. Thank you so much. So it's really nice to see the common ground that we've got on prevention and on partnerships as embodied in the panel itself. Huge thanks to the panel today for sharing their insights and their thoughts over what has happened over the past year and looking ahead. Please stay tuned. After we close off, Lindy will be taking the stage to give a few words to finish Cyber UK. Thank you.
Great, so thanks ever so much to Eleanor, Paul, Ian, Graeme and Christine for that fantastic final panel. I thought it was a brilliant set of insights into the threats we face and what we should be doing about them. Unfortunately, that was the last session of this year's Cyber UK, so it falls to me to say a few farewell words to all of you who've come with us on the journey into the unknown that was hosting Cyber UK online in a pandemic. For me, Cyber UK 2021 has showcased the things about NCSC and the wider cyber community that I am most proud of, and indeed have been evident in our response to the COVID pandemic. When it was clear we couldn't run this again in person in 2021, we just found a different way to do it. But we still produced an event that has delivered the same high quality advice, guidance and support to all of our stakeholders, and with fantastic engagement from all of you, as we can see from the chat. For the NCSC, as a part of GCHQ, hosting an event almost entirely live streamed on YouTube has been, to put it mildly, unprecedented. But we have loved it. We have learnt a lot throughout the process, and we'll take away that learning for next year and perhaps also before then, in terms of how we communicate with you. I'm incredibly proud of what we've done, and hopefully we've delivered something that you all find genuinely interesting and thought-provoking, and certainly by what I've seen in the chat, I think that's true. We're delighted we've had nearly 40,000 views across all the Cyber UK content in the past 2 days. And as I said before, we've particularly enjoyed seeing your conversations appearing alongside what we've been telling you. So while we've all been enjoying the fantastic content, both in plenary and on demand in the last 2 days, we've also been running in partnership with DCMS our very own Cyber Den. So the team claim that this is a slightly less hostile environment than its more famous BBC counterpart, though I leave that for you to judge. And the panel of Cyber Dragons heard from entrepreneurs, startups and innovators about their ideas, designs, services and products that will help to find tomorrow's solutions to some of today's cyber challenges. 11 pitches were made from people all over the country, and I'd like to thank all those who took part for their many brilliant, and in the words of Ian Levy, cool ideas. It was a strong field presenting an incredibly difficult choice in the winner. So before announcing the overall winner, 3 pitches received notable mentions. PQ Shield for their ideas around post-quantum cryptography solutions. Dark Beam for their system allowing network owners to see what would-be attackers see in order to help fix gaps. And Seclia for predictability around AI systems. But I am delighted to announce that the overall winner is Macra. Macra is a company looking to provide services to secure maritime systems by providing operational, multidimensional risk assessment tooling for global shipping. And I'm sure you'll agree that securing this vital sector against cyber threats is a hugely important goal and one that NCSC is honoured to be a part of. So well done to Macra, and you can give them all a virtual round of applause. Now, before we close, I'd like to say a few final thank yous. Firstly, thank you to all of our fantastic speakers and panellists for your incredibly interesting contributions. Thank you to Microsoft and NCC Group, our 2 lead sponsors. Thank you to BAE Systems, Palo Alto Networks, and UK CloudX, who are our 3 stream sponsors. And thank you also to all of our on-demand sponsors. Without their support, this event would not have been possible. So only a few NCSC members of staff have been in front of the camera, but behind the camera, a team of incredibly dedicated people have played absolutely crucial roles, both here in Nova and working remotely, to make this event a reality, both in terms of creating the content and running the event. So a huge thank you from me to all of them. And thank you also to Braylino Events, who've done a superbly professional job as our event delivery partner. And finally, and most importantly, thank you to all of you for joining us. You are why we run this. We feel a real sense of responsibility to help you get the most out of this. So we hope you've enjoyed it. We've certainly enjoyed your interaction, and it's good to know that, according to the chat, you agree with Ian that admins are not normal. One of the great things about hosting Cyber UK virtually is the content will continue to be available. So please do catch up with sessions you've missed and share it on social media. So before we close, I just wanted to end with one reflection. Today is the 4th anniversary of the WannaCry incident, an attack that had global impacts, including many in the NHS. As a community, we've learned huge amounts since WannaCry about how we protect ourselves online. And we've also seen this in action during the pandemic. The NHS itself has come a long way on its cybersecurity journey since then. And the NCSC and the whole of the cybersecurity industry has been really proud to step up and help protect the UK, and particularly the NHS and the health sector, during the coronavirus pandemic. But the cybersecurity threat hasn't gone away, and nor will it. You just need to look at the significant ransomware incident that our allies in the US are currently dealing with in the Colonial Oil Pipeline. And I think that underlines the need to continue to learn from what works and what doesn't. The power of telling each other stories is absolutely key. It tells us to focus relentlessly on resilience, building it in from the start. And it tells us to collaborate with partners across industry and allies abroad. And that is what Cyber UK 2021 has been about. I hope you've enjoyed it. I really hope you'll join us next year, and I really hope it will be in person in Newport in Wales for Cyber UK 2022. So finally, thank you. That's a wrap.